Health, strength, and soundness of the senses were in accordance with nature. Sickness, weakness, and mutilation were contrary to nature. But such things as the fallibility of the soul and the vulnerability of the body were neither in accordance with nature nor yet contrary to nature, but just nature. All things that were in accordance with nature had value, and all things that were contrary to nature had what we must call disvalue. In the highest sense indeed of the term value, namely that of absolute value or worth, things indifferent did not possess any value at all. But still there might be assigned to them what Antipater expressed by the term a selective value, or what he expressed by its barbarous privative a disselective disvalue. If a thing possessed a selective value, you took that thing rather than its contrary, supposing that circumstances allowed. For instance, health rather than sickness, wealth rather than poverty, life rather than death. Hence such things were called takeable, and their contraries untakeable. Things that possessed a high degree of value were called preferred. Those that possessed a high degree of disvalue were called rejected. Such as possessed no considerable degree of either were neither preferred nor rejected. Zeno, with whom these names originated, justified their use about things really indifferent, on the ground that, at court, preferment could not be bestowed upon the king himself, but only on his ministers. Things preferred and rejected might belong to mind, body, or estate. Among things preferred in the case of mind were natural ability, art, moral progress, and the like, while their contraries were rejected. In the case of the body, life, health, strength, good condition, completeness, and beauty were preferred, while death, sickness, weakness, ill condition, mutilation, and ugliness were rejected. Among things external to soul and body, wealth, reputation, and nobility were preferred, while poverty, ill repute, and baseness of birth were rejected. In this way all mundane and marketable goods, after having been solemnly refused admittance by the Stoics at the front door, were smuggled in, at a kind of tradesman entrance, under the name of things indifferent. We must now see how they had, as it were, two moral codes, one for the sage, and the other for the world in general. The sage alone could act rightly, but other people might perform the proprieties. Anyone might honor his parents, but the sage alone did it as the outcome of wisdom, because he alone possessed the art of life, the peculiar work of which was to do everything that was done as the result of the best disposition. All the acts of the sage were perfect proprieties, which were called rightnesses. All acts of all other men were sins, or wrongnesses. At their best, they could only be intermediate proprieties. The term propriety, then, is a generic one, but, as often happens, the generic term got determined in use to a specific meaning, so that intermediate acts are commonly spoken of as proprieties in opposition to rightnesses. Instances of rightnesses are displaying wisdom and dealing justly. Instances of proprieties or intermediate acts are marrying, going on an embassy, and dialectic. The word duty is often employed to translate the Greek term which we are rendering by propriety. Any translation is no more than a choice of evils, since we have no real equivalent for the term. It was applicable not merely to human conduct, but also to the actions of the lower animals, and even to the growth of plants. Now, apart from a craze for generalization, we should hardly think of the stern daughter of the voice of God in connection with an amoeba corresponding successfully to stimulus. Yet the creature in its inchoate way is exhibiting a dim analogy to duty. The term in question was first used by Zeno, and was explained by him, in accordance with its etymology, to mean what it came to one to do, so that, as far as this goes, becomingness would be the most appropriate translation. The sphere of propriety was confined to things indifferent, so that there were proprieties which were common to the sage and the fool. It had to do with taking the things which were in accordance with nature, and rejecting those that were not. Even the propriety of living or dying was determined, not by reference to virtue or vice, but to the preponderance or deficiency of things in accordance with nature. It might thus be a propriety for the sage, in spite of his happiness, to depart from life of his own accord, and for the fool, notwithstanding his misery, to remain in it. Life being in itself indifferent, the whole question was one of opportunism. Wisdom might prompt the leaving herself, should occasion seem to call for it. Since men in general were very far from being sages, it is evident that, if the Stoic morality were to affect the world at large, it had to be accommodated in some way to existing circumstances. No moral treatise, perhaps, has exercised so widespread an influence as that which was known to our forefathers under the title of Tully's Offices. Now that work is founded on Panetius, a rather unorthodox Stoic, and it does not profess to treat of the ideal morality at all, but only of the intermediate proprieties. We may notice also that in that work the attempt to regard virtue as one and indivisible is frankly abandoned, as being unsuitable to the popular intelligence. We pass on now to another instance of accommodation. According to the high Stoic doctrine, there was no mean between virtue and vice. All men, indeed, received from nature the starting points for virtue, but until perfection had been attained, they rested under the condemnation of vice. It was, to employ an illustration of the poet-philosopher Cleanthes, as though nature had begun an iambic line and left men to finish it. Until that was done, they were to wear the fool's cap. The Peripatetics, on the other hand, recognized an intermediate state between virtue and vice, to which they gave the name of progress, or proficience. Yet so entirely had the Stoics, for practical purposes, to accept this lower level, that the word proficience has come to be spoken of as though it were of Stoic origin. Seneca is fond of contrasting the sage with the proficient. The sage is like a man in the enjoyment of perfect health, but the proficient is like a man recovering from a severe illness, with whom an abatement of the paroxysm is equivalent to health, and who is always in danger of a relapse. It is the business of philosophy to provide for the needs of these weaker brethren. The proficient is still called a fool, but it is pointed out that he is a very different kind of fool from the rest. Further, proficients are arranged into three classes, in a way that reminds one of the technicalities of Calvinistic theology. First of all, there are those who are near wisdom, but however near they may be to the door of heaven, they are still on the wrong side of it. According to some doctors, these were already safe from backsliding, differing from the sage only in not having yet realized that they had attained to knowledge. Other authorities, however, refused to admit this, and regarded the first class as being exempt only from settled diseases of the soul, but not from passing attacks of passion. Thus did the Stoics differ among themselves as to the doctrine of final assurance. The second class consisted of those who had laid aside the worst diseases and passions of the soul, but might at any moment relapse into them. The third class was of those who had escaped one mental malady, but not another, who had conquered lust, let us say, but not ambition, who disregarded death, but dreaded pain. This third class, adds Seneca, is by no means to be despised. Epictetus devotes a dissertation to the same subject of progress or proficience. The only true sphere for progress, he declares, is that in which one's work lies. If you are interested in the progress of an athlete, you expect to see his biceps, not his dumbbells. And so in morality, it is not the books a man has read, but how he has profited by them that counts. For the work of man is not to master Chrysippus on impulse, but to control impulse itself.